A 15-year-old kid, sitting in his bedroom in Florida, broke into the computers of NASA and the United States Department of Defense using a cheap personal computer and freely available software. He didn't have a team. He didn't have a degree. He didn't even have formal training. What he downloaded wasn't just some random file. It was the source code that controlled the life support systems on the International Space Station, the software that kept astronauts alive in orbit. And when the government finally caught him, they had a serious problem. Their laws weren't built for this. Jonathan James, online alias C0M Raid, spelled with a zero, became the first juvenile in American history to be sent to prison for cybercrime. This is the story of how a 15-year-old exposed just how unprepared the most powerful government on Earth was for the digital age. To understand what he actually did, you need to understand what he broke into, because this wasn't a school network or a small company's server. His two main targets were the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the part of the U.S. Department of Defense responsible for tracking threats from nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons, and NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. In June 1999, James installed something called a packet sniffer onto a government server. Think of it like a hidden microphone planted inside a building's telephone system, listening to every conversation that passes through. The sniffer captured usernames, passwords, and session tokens as they moved between government machines on the internal network. With those stolen credentials, he moved quietly through at least 13 different Department of Defense computer systems, reading, watching, and taking what he wanted. Then he got into NASA network and pulled the source code that controlled the environmental systems aboard the International Space Station, the software managing temperature, oxygen, and air pressure for astronauts living in orbit. NASA took this seriously enough that they shut down their systems for several weeks to investigate the damage and patch the holes he had walked through. The total cost, including the value of the stolen software and the price of fixing the security gaps, was put at roughly $1.7 million. Now here's what makes this case truly alarming. Jonathan James did all of this using tools that anyone could download for free. He was not a genius operating with secret knowledge. He was a teenager with patience, curiosity, and months of methodical practice. The fact that those tools were enough to read traffic on the Defense Threat Reduction Agency's network, an agency whose job is to protect against weapons of mass destruction, said something deeply uncomfortable about the state of government cybersecurity in 1999. Federal investigators traced the intrusions back to his home in South Florida through careful technical work over roughly a year. When agents searched his house, James was still only 15 years old. Because he was a minor, he went through the juvenile court system rather than facing the adult criminal penalties that would have applied to an older hacker. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of juvenile delinquency and was sentenced, at age 16, to 6 months in a juvenile detention facility. On top of that, he was placed on probation until he turned 18, banned from recreational computer use, and required to write formal letters of apology to both NASA and the Department of Defense. The Guinness Book of World Records officially recognized his case as the first juvenile conviction for cybercrime in the United States. His arrest forced a difficult conversation inside the federal government. The sentence available for a juvenile hacker who had penetrated some of the most sensitive systems in the country was 6 months in a youth facility. That mismatch between the severity of the offense and the tools the legal system had available made the case a turning point in how lawmakers started thinking about cybercrime law. But Jonathan James's story didn't end at his juvenile sentence, and this is where it takes a much darker turn. In 2007, one of the largest retail data breaches in history came to light. The TJX companies, the parent company of T.J. Maxx and Marshalls, announced that attackers had stolen the credit and debit card numbers of what initially appeared to be 45.7 million customers. The investigation that followed eventually identified the mastermind as a hacker named Albert Gonzalez, a 25-year-old who had been simultaneously working as a paid informant for the U.S. Secret Service while running one of the largest hacking operations in history. As federal investigators widened the TJX probe, they began looking at a circle of hackers connected to the operation, and Jonathan James's name appeared in that circle. Although he had stayed out of trouble since his juvenile conviction years earlier, federal agents raided his home. By accounts published after his death, James was terrified of being prosecuted for crimes he had not committed, of being swept up into a case he believed had nothing to do with him. On May 18, 2008, Jonathan James was found dead at his home in Parkland, Florida, from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was 24 years old. He left behind a note expressing his belief that the justice system had already decided his guilt and that he had no way to prove otherwise. No court ever charged him in connection with the TJX breach. No evidence was ever made public establishing that he was involved. His case has since been discussed in cybersecurity literature, policy circles, and journalism for three reasons that outlast the headline. First, it proved that in the late 1990s, the technical barrier between a curious teenager and the most sensitive government systems in the world was shockingly low. Second, it exposed a genuine gap in the legal framework. The juvenile justice system was not designed for offenses that could theoretically threaten national security. Third, and most quietly, it raised a question that nobody ever answered cleanly. When you pursue a former juvenile offender into a new investigation, what standard of evidence should you be held to before you knock on the door? The alias C0M raid, spelled with a zero, still comes up whenever historians of early hacking map out the moment when the digital era stopped being a curiosity and started being a threat. A bedroom in Florida, a cheap computer, a packet sniffer, and an agency whose job was to protect against weapons of mass destruction, whose network a 15-year-old could read like a newspaper. If you want to understand how the government eventually scrambled to catch up, the laws they rewrote, the agencies they built, and the battles they still haven't won, the video on screen right now picks up exactly where this story ends.